We live in the most information-rich era in human history, and yet belief in pseudoscience is growing instead of shrinking. This is the central paradox of the modern world. The same civilization that landed humans on the moon, decoded the human genome, and built particle accelerators now produces millions of people who openly deny these achievements. Some claim the moon landing never happened. Others believe vaccines are tools of control, that the Earth is flat, or that invisible energies can cure disease. This is not a fringe phenomenon confined to the uneducated or isolated. It spreads among people with access to universities, technology, and endless data. The question is no longer why science is complex, but why so many reject it even when evidence is overwhelming. At first glance, this seems irrational, but the roots of pseudoscience are not ignorance alone. They are emotional, psychological, and deeply social. Science demands patience, uncertainty, and humility. It often delivers answers that are uncomfortable, impersonal, and counterintuitive. Pseudoscience offers something far more: attractive clarity, certainty, and meaning. It speaks in simple metaphors, clear villains, and comforting narratives. In a chaotic world, these stories feel safer than probability, distributions, and statistical margins of error. The rise of social media accelerated this shift. Platforms reward confidence, emotion, and repetition, not accuracy. Charismatic individuals without scientific training can reach millions, framing complex topics in ways that feel intuitive and personal. Meanwhile, real science often sounds hesitant because it is based on evidence that can change. This hesitation is interpreted as weakness rather than honesty. As a result, many people begin to trust single voices over thousands of experts. The danger is not merely misinformation, but the erosion of trust in the very process that allows knowledge to grow. This is how pseudoscience does not replace science but parasitizes it, using scientific language while rejecting scientific discipline. To understand why this happens, we must stop asking why people are stupid and start asking why the human mind is vulnerable to certain patterns of belief. The answer lies not in facts, but in psychology. The spread of pseudoscience is not driven by a lack of information, but by how the human brain processes it. Our minds did not evolve to evaluate statistical studies or peer-reviewed papers. They evolved to make fast judgments, to detect threats, to belong to groups, and to preserve internal consistency. This creates fertile ground for cognitive biases that pseudoscience exploits with precision. One of the most powerful mechanisms is cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental tension that arises when new information conflicts with deeply held beliefs. When scientific facts threaten identity, religion, politics, or worldview, the brain often chooses to reject the facts rather than revise the belief. Accepting evidence is not just an intellectual act, it can feel like a personal loss. This is why evolutionary theory, vaccine safety, or climate science trigger such intense resistance in some communities. Pseudoscience offers an escape route. It allows people to preserve identity while appearing informed. Another key factor is the human preference for simple explanations. Real science is layered, probabilistic, and often incomplete. It speaks in ranges, confidence intervals, and uncertainty. Pseudoscience speaks in absolutes. It replaces complexity with clean narratives. Someone is lying. Something is hidden. You have been deceived. These stories are easier to remember, easier to repeat, and easier to emotionally commit to. They transform confusion into clarity. Even if that clarity is false, then there is the Forer effect, also known as the Barnum effect, the tendency to accept vague, general statements as personally meaningful. This is why horoscopes, personality types, and alternative diagnostics feel accurate. They are designed to fit almost anyone, yet feel deeply personal. When combined with anecdotal evidence and confirmation bias, where people remember only what supports their belief, the illusion becomes self-reinforcing. Add to this the power of social belonging. Humans are tribal by nature. Beliefs are not adopted in isolation. They are shared, defended, creating echo chambers where dissent is punished and agreement is praised. Over time, the belief becomes part of identity, and abandoning it feels like betrayal. Under these conditions, facts alone are powerless. Understanding pseudoscience therefore requires understanding the mind itself, not as a rational machine, But as a social, emotional, and meaning-seeking system, pseudoscience does not survive on psychology alone. It thrives because the modern information environment actively rewards it. In the past, false ideas spread slowly, limited by geography, printing costs, and social barriers. Today, any claim, no matter how incorrect, can reach millions within hours. Digital platforms do not evaluate truth, they evaluate engagement. Algorithms that shape what people see are optimized for attention, not accuracy. Content that provokes fear, anger, or revelation travels faster than careful analysis. This creates a structural advantage for pseudoscience. Scientific explanations are cautious, measured, and often conditional. Pseudoscientific claims are bold, absolute, and emotionally charged. They promise hidden knowledge and insider status, framing belief as awakening rather than error. Another critical factor is misplaced authority. In science, authority comes from evidence, replication, and collective verification. In online spaces, authority comes from confidence, storytelling, and visual presentation. A single individual with a microphone, graphics, and conviction can appear more trustworthy than thousands of anonymous researchers. The absence of visible, scientific process makes expertise look like opinion. This illusion is strengthened when real scientific disagreement is presented as proof that nobody really knows. In reality, disagreement is how science advances, but pseudoscience reframes it as failure. Education systems unintentionally contribute to this vulnerability. Many people leave school knowing scientific facts but not understanding how those facts were established. They memorize conclusions without learning methodology, probability, or uncertainty. When later confronted with misinformation, they lack the tools to evaluate sources, check claims, or recognize manipulation. As a result, science becomes just another narrative competing for belief rather than a disciplined process for reducing error. Pseudoscience fills this gap by offering certainty without effort. It explains complex systems with single causes and simple villains, turning confusion into emotional resolution. In this environment, truth does not disappear, but it becomes harder to hear. The danger is not that people reject science consciously, but that they never learn how to distinguish knowledge from persuasion. To see why pseudoscience feels convincing, we need to look at how it appears in the real world, not as theory, but as experience. Take vaccines, homeopathy, flat earth beliefs, or fears around GMOs. In each case, the pattern is the same. Scientific explanations are complex, statistical, and often emotionally neutral. They talk about risk reduction, probabilities, and population-level effects. Pseudoscience reframes the same topics into personal stories and visual certainties. Vaccines are not presented as a medical tool, but as a threat, an intrusion, or a hidden agenda. A single emotional anecdote is elevated above millions of data points. Homeopathy succeeds not because it works chemically, but because it offers rituals, bottles, labels, and a feeling of care, triggering placebo effects that feel real to the user. Flat Earth theories reject centuries of measurements not by disproving them, but by replacing them with simple visuals, straight lines, flat horizons, and intuitive drawings that feel more obvious than abstract. Geometry.gmos are framed as unnatural despite relying on techniques humans have used for thousands of years, because fear of contamination is emotionally powerful. What connects all these examples is not evidence, but presentation. Pseudoscience translates uncertainty into spectacle. It uses bold colors, clear diagrams, dramatic language, and repeated symbols to create the illusion of understanding. The brain mistakes familiarity and visual clarity for truth. Repetition builds confidence, not accuracy. This is why debunking often fails. Repeating a false claim, even to deny it, can strengthen it by making it more familiar. Pseudoscience does not win debates. It wins attention. It fills the gap between what science knows and what people feel comfortable accepting. Until this gap is understood and addressed, misinformation will continue to spread, not because it is stronger than science, but because it is easier to consume. At the center of the pseudoscience problem lies a quiet failure that rarely gets attention. Education systems teach answers, but not thinking. Most people leave school knowing that the earth is round, that vaccines work, and that gravity exists, but they are never taught how these facts were discovered, how uncertainty is handled, or how knowledge is tested. When later confronted with persuasive misinformation, They have no framework to evaluate claims, only memories to defend. Science becomes a list of conclusions rather than a method. This creates a dangerous symmetry where scientific statements and pseudoscientific claims appear equal, just competing opinions. One video says vaccines are safe, another says they are harmful, and without methodological literacy, both seem equally valid. Education often avoids probability, statistics, and cognitive bias, the very tools needed to navigate modern information. As a result, people struggle with risk assessment. They demand absolute certainty where none exists, and interpret changing scientific recommendations as proof of deception rather than refinement. This is where pseudoscience exploits the gap. It offers confidence without nuance, certainty without revision, and explanations without math. The problem is amplified by cultural signals. Success is increasingly associated with visibility rather than expertise. Children grow up seeing influencers, rewarded more than researchers, virality more than accuracy. A study comparing aspirations showed stark differences. In some societies, children dream of exploration, engineering and science, while in others, a significant portion want to become online personalities. This shapes long-term trust in expertise. If knowledge looks slow, elitist or inaccessible, and belief looks immediate and empowering, the latter will dominate until education shifts from memorization to critical evaluation, from answers to questions, and from authority to evidence. Pseudoscience will continue to feel competitive. Science does not lose because it is wrong, but because it is demanding, and without training people to enjoy that demand, the path of least resistance will always win. Pseudoscience does not win because it is stronger than science. It wins because it is easier to live with. It removes uncertainty, offers belonging, and replaces effort with conviction. Science does the opposite. It asks for patience, for doubt, for the acceptance that some answers are incomplete or uncomfortable. This final contrast explains why pseudoscience flourishes in times of stress, complexity, and rapid change. When the world feels overwhelming, the promise of simple explanations becomes irresistible. But the solution is not censorship, shaming, or louder facts. The solution is intellectual resilience, the ability to ask how we know, not just what we know. The ability to recognize emotional manipulation, visual persuasion, and cognitive bias. Science must be taught and communicated not as a collection of conclusions, but as a process of disciplined curiosity. People do not reject science because they hate truth. They reject it because they were never taught how to engage with uncertainty without fear. This is why the future battle against pseudoscience will not be won in comment sections, but in classrooms, media literacy, and cultural values that reward understanding over confidence. The goal is not to make everyone an expert, but to make everyone harder to deceive. Pseudoscience collapses when its audience understands probability, method, and bias. It cannot survive sustained critical thinking. In the end, this is not a war between intelligence and stupidity, but between comfort and effort. Belief feels good. Knowledge takes work. And as long as society values ease over understanding, pseudoscience will remain attractive. But if curiosity is cultivated, if thinking becomes rewarding, and if uncertainty is normalized, science regains its natural advantage. Not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. The question is not whether pseudoscience will disappear. The question is whether we will choose to think anyway.